So I gave a version of this talk at the Cray Users Group meeting about a week or two ago. And so I apologize for those of you who already saw this. And in fact, there are elements of a talk that I've been giving for some years since I was at NSF, actually, that talk about trends in science and engineering that I think are really important to take stock of as we develop cyber infrastructure and collaborative environments for people to work together and so on. So all of those elements are in my talk. And I start off usually with some sort of a picture of representing traditional science and engineering community. So I've got my picture of Galileo and Newton's Principia here about, from my point of view, as a physicist, this is like the beginning of science, although of course it goes back centuries and millennia before that. But I just want to point out that there's a certain culture around doing science that has been more or less the same for actually not only decades, but in fact many centuries, where largely you would have an individual working in isolation, trying to do some computations of some kind, or trying to think about some sort of theories, and then publishing a result, as we have here in Newton's Principia, and then also having a student or two, and then it's sort of working generation by generation that way. And so science takes a long time. And over the last 5 centuries, that's more or less been the culture. And that's just changed dramatically, and not only because of computing, but because the problems people are working on are a lot more complex than they used to be. And so this illustrates where we currently are. It's been referred to colorfully as the end of science. And in fact, the month that I came to the National Science Foundation, this I think was June of 2008 when this Wired magazine cover came out, and basically it said that science as we know it is over, and it's been astounding how much things have changed. In the future, in fact, this article is over the top. It said that we'll be looking at correlations in large data sets, and from that we will derive the laws of nature and so on. And forget about theory and experiment. Of course, that's just not actually the way it will happen, but that is going to have a major impact. So I think it is true that the methodologies we've known and the culture we've known around research have changed, and they're forever changing, and really profoundly. Now, this impacts everything, not just high-performance computing, and I know it's a high-performance computing-oriented audience, but experiment in terms of the large-scale experiments, as well as the tiny experiments that are carried out in communities of scientists. For example, the Materials Genome Initiative, where you might have thousands of people in different groups working together, doing everything from simulations to experiments in small groups or around large facilities. And that's a nice example of what we are often referring to as the long tail of science. And all of this is inextricably connected these days. And I'll give you some examples of that going forward. So, okay, that's like the preview for my entire talk. So the trends in science that I want to really focus on then are these two major ones. That the collaborations are growing tremendously as the problems become more complex. So if you're a physicist, you probably learned the joke about the spherical cow, right? Which is if you were in the dairy industry and you want to maximize milk production out of a cow, and you go to a bunch of physicists, the first thing that they used to say would be, assume a spherical cow, because that makes the problem easier. But now they'd say, let me simulate this entire life form on blue waters or something like that. So they're trying to get at the actual details of the science. And so that's changing. And so in order to do that, we need to bring together people with all kinds of different expertise in order to address a problem, a single problem. And then, of course, the systems and the data sciences are growing tremendously over time as well. And in fact, at effectively exponential levels in the last years. So I like to illustrate this with trends in my own community. So going back to black holes and general relativity and gravity, on the left-hand side, you've got sort of 350, 400 years of science represented in that sort of panel that shows initially the two-body problem looked at by people like Newton and Galileo, and then later by Stephen Hawking, where he looked at what would happen when two black holes collided. And that's the space-time diagram of two black holes colliding. And he shows the event horizon, how that would develop in time going up. And so two bodies come together and form one big black hole. So that's an old-style scientific visualization, a hand-drawn sketch. If you digitize that, you'd have some kilobytes of data. And if you looked at the size of the collaboration, it was one very smart person thinking very hard about something and coming up with that science result. So about 20 years after that, I was privileged to be in a group actually working at NCSA early in my career, and we did a supercomputer calculation of that exact problem, and you can see the similarity there. I would call that an honest calculation as opposed to a hand-drawn sketch, where we worked out in detail what would happen to the event horizons, what would the gravitational wave signature look like that came from colliding black holes. But we needed a group of about 10 people, and we needed that because we had experts in parallel I/O, parallel meaning 4 processors at the time on a Cray YMP. We had people who were experts in the numerical methods needed. Both elliptic and hyperbolic systems were coupled there in nonlinear ways. We needed people who are experts in general relativity. And so we had groups that had all these kinds of expertise, and not any one of us was able to do that. Also experts in scientific visualization. About 3 years later, we did a full 3-dimensional simulation of that system. And so the one in the middle there is an axisymmetric simulation. A full 3-dimensional simulation required a lot more variables, a lot more data, a larger team, more processors. That was a 256 processor Origin 2000 that allowed us to carry out that. And look at the sizes of the collaborations. They're going up from 1 to 10, 15 over a period of 20 years or so. That's a big factor in terms of the kinds of expertise and the collaboration that was needed to do that problem. Look at the data sizes, 50 kilobytes, 50 megabytes, 50 gigabytes. And those are over increasingly shorter periods of time, 20 years and then only 3 years for the next factor of 1,000. So this is just an illustration in my own career, seeing how these things have changed. So now we've got very much larger teams, and they're not necessarily all working together on every project, but this is a picture of a thing called the European Astrophysics Network that I was leading when I was at the Max Planck Institute in Germany in the middle to late 90s, early 2000s. And there were groups from 10 different countries working together, and they were sharing both intellectual projects where, for example, some groups are working on initial data for binary in-spiral problems of black holes or neutron stars. Others are working on numerical methods for hydrodynamics. Others are working on general relativity. Others are working on perturbation theory of relativistic systems. Others are working on the coupling of these systems, the equations of state. And these typically were groups that focused specifically on that kind of expertise. You know, in Meudon, outside of Paris, in Valencia, in Potsdam, in the UK, and so on. And this is a nice picture of our team. And in fact, they all worked together because we developed a common software environment that allowed the different groups to do their own thing and then contributed in a way that was sort of, you know, binary compatible with others. And we developed this thing called the Cactus Framework, and then that evolved into a thing called the Einstein toolkit that, in fact, there are a number of people probably at the meeting. I can't see who's there, but I know some of the PRAC teams that are using Blue Waters were part of this collaboration or are somehow benefiting from it. And there are projects that are funded jointly by the NSF, by the Max Planck Gesellschaft, by different individual research groups around the world that are all contributing to this. Now, this has led to, for example, these great new breakthroughs in science. For example, this is a simulation of binary neutron star Lynn spiral carried out by Luciano Rizzola about 5 or 6 years ago using the same toolkit, where he was able to look at what happens if you add magnetic fields, and for the first time you automatically get out of the calculation these jets that you've seen for many, many years in observations, and people have been trying to model them, but they didn't really ever emerge naturally out of science calculations until you could add in more and more of the physics that had typically been ignored before. Usually ignored because, not because it was considered unimportant, but because nobody had a computer big enough to add that particular piece of science in, or they didn't have the expertise to do it, or whatever. So this is an astounding event, and I think the main point I want to point out here is that after a century of trying to solve Einstein's equations, because they were developed, in fact, 100 years ago, not today, but this year, so it's the 100th anniversary of Einstein's equations, no one could solve them, and because of these kinds of toolkits and breakthroughs, and some of the people out there at the meeting are among the groups that were the leaders in actually making these breakthroughs. Manuela Campanelli, for example, I think might be out there, and others, Christian Ott, also using the same toolkit for other kinds of calculations that I'll show you in just a minute, it is now possible for any graduate student to solve these equations that eluded entire sets of scientists, physicists, mathematicians for an entire century, including Einstein himself, Hawking, and others. This is now able to be done by any student. It's because of the advances in computational science and because of the software environments, which I would consider as part of that. So, now that you can do this, the entire universe is sort of open to you for investigation. It's one of your tools, and you need teams of people with lots of expertise, you need software environments to integrate that expertise, and you need machines that have enough capacity in order to put all of those ingredients in. And so one great example of this is some work that Christian's group is doing now out at Caltech. And so going from axisymmetry in stellar core collapse, so you can actually add in very detailed treatment of radiation transport, adding neutrinos, calculating how photons would propagate through the very dense material, using advanced equations of state, and so on. You can begin to calculate what would this core collapse look like in photons, in neutrinos, in gravitational waves, all in the same calculation. And then, of course, we have big experiments like LIGO looking at gravitational waves. And advanced LIGO is going to be commissioned just next month to actually observe these kinds of systems in gravitational waves. It may see them within the first year. So that would be astounding. 100 years after Einstein predicted gravitational waves exist, that we finally were able to detect them. They would be coming from things like this. Now, this calculation in full 3D was only able to be carried out on a system the size of blue waters, and of course the results are not only quantitatively but qualitatively very different from what you observe if you restrict it to axisymmetry, and you don't have enough capacity to do these detailed calculations in full 3D without a machine the size of blue water. So in fact, the structures which are illustrated here in these lower right-hand pictures are qualitatively very different. So the fluid flow, the gravitational wave signature, and so on would not be like what was predicted according to the axisymmetric calculations. Now, if you want to go to the next generation where you really want to follow the explosion of this core collapse and then the rebound out in a sort of supernova explosion, all the way to the point where the outer parts of the star are ejected, you need something like 10,000 times more computer power in order to do all of that all the way through the core bounce and the full explosion to look at, say, what the photon signature would look like. So this comes back to something I'll come back to in a little bit about multi-messenger astronomy, which will be a new field of astronomy that's emerging. That's the convergence of multiple other fields: optical astronomy, radio astronomy, neutrino astronomy, cosmic ray physics, and the simulation of all of that coming together. And that's where the integration of the science, the data, the computation, that all comes together. So I'll just point out there are lots and lots of problems. If you want to do the formation, evolutions of jets, the post-black hole formation, and so on, and these stellar core collapse things, you look at you're having adaptive mesh refinement, and so on. You could saturate machines the size of blue waters, or any conceivable future version of them for a long time. I mean, this is a sort of a back-of-the-envelope calculation of saturating a machine, running blue waters full out for 70 days. You could do this and not be done with your calculation. So there's plenty of science to do in these machines. To do this, you need these multiphysics frameworks. And so what I've been talking about is multiphysics science. We just had a very exciting private sector program meeting here all week last week. So we had about 50 companies here, hundreds of people. We actually had dinner at the football stadium here at the University of Illinois. And they talk about the same things, but the astrophysics isn't the application. It's what they call fluid flow in porous media, for example, or diapers. And so this is the same exact problem. It's not relativistic, but it's fluid flow, and it has very, very complex phenomenology that must be simulated on scales of machines like blue waters and beyond in order to get this right. This has a lot to do with the economic effectiveness or competitiveness of a company, and that's, of course, really important. And I know, some of you might be there from NSF, how important that is to justify investments of billions of dollars into basic science. It has to come back to really enable society and be good for economic development of the country. And these are just perfect examples where even on facilities like blue waters, there's a lot of activity that leads not only to scientific discovery but directly to economic development. So, in fact, in this Cactus toolkit, related to the Einstein toolkit, there were things called the CFD toolkit that used the same message passing layers, the same adaptive mesh refinement layers, the same I/O layers, and so on, but different physics are inserted into that. And so the same teams that develop the framework for all of the sort of computational science part can engage with astrophysicists or with fluid structure interaction people or with people doing crack propagation or plasma physics and so on. So the computational science is really quite broad. So let me just say a couple words about how the HPC systems have been evolving in time. And I started with a picture of a Cray YMP, then I moved up to an Origin 2000, and move up, I don't know how many orders of magnitude, but quite a few orders of magnitude, 6 or more, I'm sure, and you're up to machines of the size of blue waters, and so I won't dwell on this since many of you know much more about using the machine than I do, but of course, it is an awesome machine with, very importantly, over a petabyte of memory. Most machines that talk about how large they are or how fast they are don't have such memory, and that's what allows the complexity of a problem to be done at a scale of the kinds of problems I was just talking about. And of course, these things generate huge amounts of data, so the I/O is very important. Not only the storage and data services around that, and I'll come back to that the last part of my talk. That's going to be an increasingly part of all of this environment, but the connections to the wide area networks. And in fact, we're developing networks here that will connect the Blue Waters machine and the building that it's in to Chicago at speeds of over 400 gigabits a second. And then from there, of course, is where the international connection points are. And so we're very highly connected so that you all out there using the machine from remote sites or need to combine this with observational data that could also be of order petabytes of data, will have the facility to do that. And those are the trends that are being driven by the science problems we're doing. So let me just skip ahead. So we have a big computing facility, and if you haven't seen it, you should come see it. It's very glorious, but I'll just go to the next slide. Now, as you all know, I think at this meeting, it's not just, sometimes I hear, oh, it's only like 3 different groups that actually are capable of using Blue Waters. It's an enormous number of different groups in different science areas that are using Blue Waters. About 700 active members of the teams are currently using Blue Waters, and across many different parts of the spectrum of faculty or industrial partners or postdocs. And really importantly there, and this is, I think, one of the key points for going forward, graduate students. So the largest chunk of this is graduate students. This means that this is a vibrant community, and it's a growing community. And it means that the next generation of scientists who are doing problems will think of this as just one of the tools in their quiver, and so that they can attack problems with a machine of this scale and beyond. And these are not largely computer science students. In fact, very few of them are. They're domain scientists from the geosciences, from the biosciences, and so on. I'll show you an example in just a minute of the breakdown there. In fact, here. So this is in the last year of the usage of Blue Waters by discipline. Particle physics is about a quarter of it. Biology and biophysics is just as much. And in fact, this is one of the trends that is clearly one of the trends of the 21st century. Biomedicine activities are going to dwarf those probably of all other sciences going forward. And as you know, NIH is 5 times the size of the NSF in terms of its funding. There were many, many biomedical problems that are increasingly becoming data and computationally oriented. So I'll have an example of that to tell you about in a minute. So it's across all areas of science and engineering. So let me give a couple of examples beyond the ones I gave already about breakthrough science. So the first one, and Homa's probably in the audience there, so I don't want to embarrass myself by botching a description of your science, Homa, if you're there, but I think it's extraordinary the kind of science you're able to do, studying solar flares all the way from the heliosphere through the propagation of the Earth-Sun environment in the sort of inner solar system, all the way to the Earth, and understanding how it interacts with the Earth's magnetic field, how the magnetic field of the Earth actually acts as a shield to protect us. And so I have a couple of slides home on this, including the beautiful illustrations by Donna and team, but I think you've already seen that there, and to save time, I won't go into the depth of it there, but the extraordinary scale of the calculation with 10 billion cells, trillions of particles, using hundreds of terabytes of memory, gives you an idea, 500,000 cores. This is the kind of thing that can only be done on a system the size of blue waters. And you probably all heard of the Carrington event of 1856. I forgot, I might have a slide on it, but I'm going to skip over it if I get to it, where there was a solar flare about 150 years ago that created such disruption that telegraph systems and the sort of the telecommunication systems of the day were not only disrupted, but in some cases even destroyed. Imagine what would happen today. There was no sensitive electronics, there were no microprocessors available then. And so understanding the interaction is not only a matter of communications and societal impact, but of national security and so on. So this has direct relevance, of course. And being able to simulate the entire system from the inside of the sun all the way to the Earth is something that can only be done on a machine of the scale of blue waters and beyond. Another one, terrific example, and a number of you out there are probably maybe doing simulations like this, molecular dynamics and atomistic simulations of systems that are now on a scale of 100 million towards 1 billion atoms. And at that many atoms, and this is individual quantum mechanical calculations done at that scale where you're treating them on the individual atomic interactions, but doing it on a scale of a machine where you have 500,000 cores, so you can actually do almost entire life forms, like the HIV capsid or the chromatophore of a cell, looking at entire cellular organelle. How is photosynthesis done from first principles? So this is on the verge of simulating entire life forms. And that's just really exciting, not just entire life forms, but how they might interact, for example, with antiviral drugs, for example, or looking at the emergence of life from chemistry. So we're on the verge of being able to do this kind of a thing on machines at the size of blue waters and the next generation beyond. So that's just sort of some snapshots of where we're seeing just in the supercomputing area. I just want to point out that, of course, it's really important to be working with the younger community and the diversity of the community, very important for sustaining the ecosystem of computational science, I think. And so there are lots of graduate students. As I mentioned earlier, we have a number of fellows, both undergraduate, postdoc, and graduate student fellowships of different kinds. Some are supported directly through interactions with Blue Waters, probably the Shodor Foundation's out there, Scott and others, in terms of the education programs, developing not only across Blue Waters, but with Exceed, the interaction of growing the community. It's happening. It's very exciting. There are over 100 computational science programs in the country. About 150 I had to actually report to the ACCI about 5 years ago, led by Tinsley Oden, about the growth of computational science. So it's clearly a growing field. And as you know, if you're doing it especially, it's differentiated from your theoretical physics or from your computer science, and it's not really a linear combination. It's the emergence of a new kind of science and a new discipline. And I think it's very important that we support it as such going forward. And so we're doing that, and you're all doing that out there as well. So I just wanted to have a plug. Maybe I'll just only give the first slide here about the work that Donna Cox has with her team with the new funded project from NSF called Cadence, the Centrality of Advanced Digitally Enabled Science. I think it's very exciting what's going on with this. There are dozens of projects that have been selected through a very sophisticated peer review process. We've assembled an extremely good scientific advisory board, including people like former president of the American Physical Society, executive director of the American Astronomical Society, the president of SciAm, I would call that if you had a society called the Computational Science and Applied Mathematics Society, and so on. So people are really working hard to figure out how to best tell the story of this kind of science and its impact on society across the country. And so the first of these is going to be the first of the many activities. Let me back up a slide. There will be, I thought there was a slide here that says how many documentaries, but quite a few documentaries are going to be done very professionally, working with Tom Lucas out of New York, and a number of dome shows in extraordinarily high resolution version, and then narrated by by some of the best names out there in terms of name recognition. Benedict Cumberbatch, other productions in this series in the past have included people like Jodie Foster or Liam Neeson, who've narrated these things. So these are really highly professional, and I'm very excited about the impact this will have on telling the message out there. So I'm going to, this is a slide on the Carrington event, just to save some time, I'm going to skip this. Sorry, home, I'm skipping over your beautiful visualization, and then John Wise is on formation of the early universe, since I need to save a little bit of time, but I'm sure you'll have a chance to see these things there, or maybe you've already seen them. So let me say a couple of words about industry use. It is true that industry absolutely needs this kind of computing in order to advance. And the fact that we had over 50 companies here spending a week here at NCSA is a testament to that. In many cases, they are not at the level with their codes of being able to scale up to a machine the size of Blue Waters, but they want to, and they've got problems that really demand that. And so we have partnerships with them in order to try to address that. And I just wanted to point out, this is an example of the members of NCSA's private sector program. As you can see, it's over a number of sectors: manufacturing, technology, energy, health sciences, life sciences. I see it's in the middle there, and includes hospitals like the Mayo Clinic and so on. It includes manufacturing like Rolls-Royce, chemical companies, and Caterpillar, agriculture. It's all there, and it's needed not just for the high-performance computing, but increasingly with the fusion and the infusion of data, and then the fusion of computation and data-enabled methods to look at problems, because these are clearly real-world problems. These people are not focused on doing black hole collisions, but they are focused on the problems that are just as complex as that impact their bottom line. So I think I'll skip over this and just point out that there's been a lot of progress by the team here at NCSA, in particular with Ahmed and Saeed Korik, who I think is out there, scaling to very large numbers of cores. And these are fairly recent results, taking commercial codes, working with the companies, and then in some cases, experimental codes like the ELIA code in a project with the Barcelona Supercomputing Center, where we're able to scale with a lot of hard work actual industrial codes for real problems up to almost the scale of Blue Waters now. So I think this will have a lot of impact on economic development going forward. So just here's an example of a problem simulating processes in the human respiratory system. So in order to stay true to my time, I think Chelron wanted me to finish in about 40 minutes. I'm going to try to just skip through here and get into what are some future directions here. So we've been thinking a lot about what's the next generation of cyber infrastructure that's needed to support these kinds of sciences, particularly given the fact that we're bringing in observation systems. So in fact, I skipped over this, but I think about 60% of the Blue Waters PRAC teams actually have some kind of data, either from observations or from some simulations that are coupled and so on, that are actually connected into the simulations. And so you see that everywhere, this trend of the data and the simulation connecting. And so we had these workshops sponsored by NSF, two of them in Dallas, that Bill Gropp and John Towns helped organize, and so a number of you out there and in this room were actually at that meeting, or those two meetings, where we sort of surveyed what are the trends you see in the next 10 years. And of course, people are saying, we want to do longer runs, we want more accuracy, we want to solve a greater variety of problems, we need more sophisticated algorithms. That's the same old story as always, and so that's important. But there are two things that are changing that are really different, and I called them out specifically. Changing workflow methods. So you're going to see a lot of workflow changes where you need to accelerate in sort of a pipeline of activities, from simulation to data fusion to another kind of a simulation to data fusion again, and so on. So for example, I used to live in Louisiana years ago, and we had Hurricane Katrina hit, and I got pretty involved in what it took to do a projection of the hurricane and how to respond. What about the emergency response scenario? And it became clear that we have a sort of a pipeline where we have satellite observations of the Gulf of Mexico. We have sensors deployed across the Gulf of Mexico on things like so the oil platforms, or we need to know wave heights or the temperatures and the wave currents and all of that. And those go together, and then there's a storm model that projects the track of where that hurricane is going to go. How will it intensify? How will the waves respond to it, and so on. And so particularly the atmospheric models require infusion of all those other data sources for the initial conditions. And then, in principle, as simulations are going on, you could inject additional data to improve the simulation. Then, once the storm track is known, if the storm is going to go through, say, to the coast of Texas, or to the coast of Louisiana, or to the coast of Florida, it turns out that you need a different set of models to couple to figure out how does the water respond. Because so the atmospheric model tells you how the winds respond, and then you couple the output of that model to the input of the storm surge models. And you have different storm surge models that tell you how the water responds as the wind blows it, depending on whether it's going to a sandy area or a marshy area, or a muddy area, and so on. So those are all different models. And so you have this sort of combinatorial problem almost. It's going to go here. We have to couple that to this model. Oh, it's going to go there. We have to couple it to a different model. And then you have to think about, once you figure out how the wind is going to blow the water, what do you do about supplies? Will the levees hold? And so there are these workflows just in that one model, and you have to connect them all within a period of about 5 days. And it's not like something you're going to do as an academic exercise over the next 2 months. That hurricane's going to hit, and you have to have emergency response. And you talk about people's lives at stake, and millions of dollars of damage potentially, or billions of dollars. And so that's an example, but in emergency response. But you see these now everywhere in astrophysics and material science and so on. So this is an idea of workflow. So how do we couple the data and the different models that need to be computed in real time potentially? That's an example of the changing workflow. So we'll have to create specific kinds of cyber infrastructure that enable all of that to be done more routinely, more rapidly, in order to advance science and emergency response in many other scenarios. And then the second one there is about the integration with data sources that combine simulation and data. So I'll give you a couple of examples of that going forward. I'll focus mostly on the data. So everybody, you hear about big data all the time now, and there's this book, The Fourth Paradigm, The Data Tsunami, and all of this. And the thing I want to point out is supercomputing is still here in this picture. Sometimes people forget that, but it is actually, with huge amounts of data, like petabytes of data, that implies petaflops of computing. You have to compute all that. It's digital, has to be computed. So the supercomputer is not to be left behind in all of this, although it's sort of a smaller piece of a growing universe. And so you have to think about how these things play well in an ecosystem. So while the computer says I'm still here, the data tsunami says, but I'm your new big baby brother, and I've got millions of processors. So we have clouds out there now, and they're big clouds, millions of processors, but they don't necessarily do problems like a stellar core collapse in 3D with general relativity very well, and their I/O systems are typically limited. But they have certain kinds of advantages. So integrating these different things, because the problems require different kinds of expertise, different kinds of codes, all on the same problem. That's where the future action is going to be, I think. So I'll go back to my picture of Galileo and sort of the story of the first couple slides I had, and then say, on the data side, not just the simulation side, you have this example of the Sloan Digital Sky Survey from around 15 years ago when it got started. It generated about 40 terabytes of data over a decade, and that data are then provided to the entire worldwide community. You have libraries that curate that data. It's available for anybody to look at. Thousands of people can access it, and in fact, that data hasn't even all been analyzed yet. It's still only a fraction of that has actually been analyzed at the level of depth that people would really like to. So that's just one example. Now we have these other telescopes, the Dark Energy Survey that's going on now, and the Large Synoptic Survey Telescope, which is pictured here, which will be available in about 6 years in operations. And the LSST project is really extraordinary because it's going to take a picture of the southern hemisphere, the southern sky. So it points in some direction and it takes a picture. Each picture is going to have 3 gigapixels behind it in the cameras. It's got an amazing camera that's being developed by the Department of Energy. And then it takes another picture about another 20 seconds later. It moves a little bit, and it just keeps cycling through the entire sky. And it does it all night long, and it does it the next night and the next night. And over 3 days, it gets an entire picture of the southern hemisphere. And then it starts over again. And then 3 days later, it starts over again. So it's going to develop a movie. And then every night, it's going to say, I discovered 1 million new things that were different from 3 days ago. So who's going to analyze that? So we need to develop machine learning algorithms for that. And lots of science needs to be developed just to handle the feature extraction in how those pixels change from one night to the next. And it's going to generate as much data as the Sloan Digital Sky Survey did an entire decade. It's going to generate this much data every single night. And this data has to then be sent up from the mountaintop in Chile up to NCSA, where processing will be done immediately, and then alerts will be sent out to the entire community to say, something happened. Look in this area and make sure that you catch that in gravitational waves or in neutrinos or whatever. So people can do electromagnetic, gravitational wave, neutrino follow-ups immediately, because these are time-dependent events. And so something might change dramatically over a few days, and then you can catch things blowing up or as they evolve with this kind of a technique. So we need to be able to do this. This is a real-time sort of environment. This is a picture of a young astronomer that when I was at NSF, I discovered, I never met her, but her name is Kathy Gray from Canada. And she is a 10-year-old at the time this picture was taken. And she discovered a supernova because data were made freely available from a Canadian observatory. And so the youngest person ever to discover a supernova. Her father was an amateur astronomer. And so what Kathy Gray is asking is, how do I find data? How do I verify it? And how do I use it to do some science? And at age 10, kids are asking this already. So it's kind of amazing. Then it turns out, I learned last year that her 9-year-old brother later also discovered a supernova. So it's this is the kind of trend that we're seeing in science and engineering these days. So this is an example that I'm very personally passionate about and fond of, called multi-messenger astronomy, where I've drawn this picture of the world now with optical networks as the background, and you can see they're going down to South America, where data will be transported up. We're going to have this array of instruments, each of which could be sort of $1 billion class instrument. These are MREFC projects from NSF, as well as the large computing environment. And for any one of these things, a gamma ray burst goes off, black holes collide, neutron stars, supernovae, you will be able to observe it from all of these different kinds of environments potentially, and you're going to want to simulate it also at the same time. And so we have to develop this cyber infrastructure that's highly integrated, where the data and the computing come together, and the teams are able to work, and they don't know each other, because they will be coming from very different corners of the world or from different disciplines, and that's the environment we have to create. So I think I'm really running out of time. I'll just say that people can only communicate this way by sharing data. So we want to create the environment where they can share data. We see scenarios like this in every field of science and engineering. So I've got pictures here that represent social sciences, earth sciences. There's my Hurricane Katrina picture, and so on. Materials, genome, you name it. So I'll skip this just to point out the materials genome is an idea that if you can make materials properties available through data sharing of where the data come from, either simulations or from experiments or from individual laboratories or historical data, you could vastly accelerate the discovery, propagation of knowledge, discovery of new things. And if it were available to companies, you could impact their bottom line, because they will more quickly get the knowledge that's coming out of the laboratories. And so the tagline for the materials genome was something like, discoveries in half the time and making materials at half the cost. It was something like that, twice as fast at half the cost. And I think that there's some truth in that actually happening as a result of these kinds of investments. So if you're working these days in science and engineering, this is the environment you find. You're on a campus, you've got all these instruments, you've got optical networks, you've got supercomputers, and you have to think about how you educate people in this environment, not the one that we all learned in, but the one that people are actually living in today. So how do we build this environment that supports this complex problem solving for academia and industry. So I'm going to just skip ahead. There are some activities around the National Data Service Consortium that a number of us have been involved in. We're very passionate about what's going on. We've had 3 meetings. The last one was in Austin, Texas. So if you're interested in learning more about what we're trying to do to create data sharing capabilities that allow people to work together and tie this to publications, take a look at that. The vision for this is to make it easy for anyone to create a data object, then to make it discoverable by someone else, to have it connected to a publication, so that you might discover it, in fact, just by reading the journal article. And we have some pilot programs with the American Physical Society and with Elsevier and with Science in order to do that. And then to provide analysis services on top of that. So, for example, if you're doing blue waters, and there are a number of groups, in fact, probably in the audience there, who are doing large-scale simulations, and they'd like to make their data sets available. For example, cosmology simulations, you could treat as if they were an actual observation in astronomy, and then provide that data set, and then tools for people to analyze it. You may well discover things that the original authors, or the simulators, let's say, didn't actually see in it in the first place. And so this is something that we're very interested in, and there's been a lot of demand for this going forward. So there's a Blue Waters data sharing service, and this will be connected into the pilots of the National Data Service Consortium and so on. So I think I'll stop there. So Chelren, I hope I'm not too far over. I think maybe I'm a minute early compared to where I need to be. So just say the culture of research is changing really dramatically. Data-enabled science is going to be an important part of the change in culture to make it possible to integrate these different things. I think data is one of the great integrators, and we need to find the way to provide the services. And we're trying to respond to all of these trends by creating cyber infrastructure that supports it all. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
So Ed, thank you very much. I assume you can hear me. Tremendous applause coming from this side of the nation. I think that we do have, thanks again for fitting that into the time period, but I wanted to see, I think we do have time for a question or two. The microphone's up here on the podium, so I'm going to repeat the question if anybody has one from this side of the world. Win May.
So the question is, there's good data and bad data. What's the plan for figuring out which data is good, which data is bad?
So the question is, there's good data and bad data. What are the plans to figure out which data is the good one and which data are not so good? Are there plans in terms of the National Data Service or other things to help figure that out?
There are different schemes for that, of course. So there's the idea that data might be peer-reviewed, and so there's a lot of discussion about how to create that, even journals of various kinds that would effectively be gateways to data and to have them peer-reviewed in different ways. But there's another idea, which is there's a lot of peer review already going on with journals, the traditional journals, and if you were to associate data with that, then that's already gone through a scientific vetting process, and I think that will be an important part of that going forward. So, for example, we have already had discussions with APS, and that's the American Physical Society, Elsevier, and Science, as I mentioned, but specifically in the pilots with the National Data Service Consortium, would we be able to provide early access that are available to data sets that are linked to publications that are being submitted for review? The access would be only to the authors and to the editor and to the reviewers initially. So that would be part of the entire review process. And then only when the paper is finally published would that be made available more generally. And so there's some thinking about this, but it's pretty early on. Another point is that, in fact, I got into a lot of trouble once when I was making a presentation on the National Science Board. I was presenting the case for LIGO's evolving data policy. And there were some who wanted the data to be made available to everyone, all data available. Why would you hide it? And the answer was, well, the data are largely actually just noise. And so it takes a lot of expertise in able to interpret in any scientific way what this data are really telling you. You have to run templates from numerical simulation to black holes colliding, like stuff that Manuela might be doing, or Christian, and so on. And so that's needed. And so if you don't provide some kind of a gating process on who has access to the data or what's actually released generally to the public, then you're going to create sort of more chaos into the system. Now some people buy that argument and some don't. So you know, the community will ultimately sort this out. But there's some thinking about that.
We have another question.
Is the time for a single researcher can develop code and be successful over? It looks to me like, with, for instance, CESM, where a community comes together and shares codes and develops codes.
So the question is the time for a single individual or researcher to develop a code that has impact over, because there are so many codes that have large communities developing small parts of those codes. So is that a fundamental change of the way we'll be progressing in our science?
I don't think it's not exactly over, but the way it's being done is different. So I mean, you know, in the early days when people were building the first computers, you had to build everything from the operating system, you know, on up to the application. I mean, so there are people who are able to do these kind of things on very primitive systems. And so now you don't think twice about using, say, Linux as your operating system. And increasingly you don't think twice about developing your own message passing. You just use someone's MPI implementation. And then as you get higher up the stack, for example, people in relativistic astrophysics, many of them are using the Cactus framework because it provides a lot of the message passing and things that are very useful to them. But then they still develop their own modules, and that some things are shared by the communities and considered standard modules, and other things are developed individually. So it still comes down to an individual graduate student, even in a complex sort of ecosystem like that, can develop their own things that they have their own intellectual pride and joy over, as well as their own sort of exploration and path, and they still can run into the dead ends. It's not just, you know, changing parameter files in somebody else's code. It's bringing in a new MHD module or something like that, where you can then take advantage of what others have done. So I think we're not sort of creating the big machine that you have to buy into in order to do science anymore, but we're providing more and more opportunities for people to do it.
One more question, if there is one. No, so thank you very much, Ed. Thanks for taking the time to share with us, and we wish you were here, and probably you do too. So
I do.
Thank you very much.